October 1959. Wickenburg, Arizona, a general mercantile store on Tegner Street, 4 blocks from the Hassayampa River crossing, where the desert scrub runs south toward the Vulture Mountains and the ranches spread out in every direction and have been buying on ledger credit since the store opened. The closing notice is in the window. It went up on a Monday. Agnes Coulter had written it herself on a piece of cardboard from a flour sack box in her best hand and taped it inside the glass beside the door handle where a person coming in would have to look past it to enter. It said, "Closing sale, all stock reduced. Final date Nov 15. She had written it on Saturday night after the week's accounting because she could read a ledger and the ledger said what it said. And she was not a woman who put off hard things by pretending they were not yet decided. The store had been closing for 2 years. She had simply not said so until now. Here is the story. The store had been Agnes Coulter's for 24 years, and her father's for 14 years before that. Her father, Burl, had opened it in 1921 when Wickenburg was a cattle town and a mining town and a stage road town, and all 3 of those things required a mercantile that would carry what a man needed on a line of credit until the season turned. Burl had run it on the ledger system, goods against credit, settled quarterly, extended without question to the families he knew and had known for years. Agnes had come behind the counter at 18 in 1933, during the worst of the Depression, when the ledger balances were long and the quarterly settlements were partial, and the alternative was to stop extending credit and watch the ranching families of Maricopa County go without flour and salt and lamp oil, which her father would not do. She took over completely when Burl died in 1945, and she ran it the same way he had run it, on the same principles, with the same ledger book that had been in use since 1921, each family's account on its own page. Updated in her clean bookkeeper's hand every time a purchase was made and every time a balance was settled. The store smelled of pinnin coffee beans and flour dust and the dry sweetness of dried chilies hanging in a rope near the door. And underneath it, all the particular smell of a general store that has been in one building long enough for the smell to be the building itself. Wood and paper, and 100 different goods sharing the same air for 38 years. The floorboards were pine, painted gray originally, worn through to raw wood at the main traffic path from the door to the counter. The counter was dark oak, smooth at the lip from 3 decades of forearms. The ceiling fan turned slowly and moved the October heat without breaking it. A radio on the shelf behind the counter played something in the mornings that nobody was particularly listening to, and went off at noon when Agnes needed quiet to do the accounts. The south-facing windows caught the late afternoon light and laid it across the counter in long gold bars that moved toward the door as the day went on. Agnes had never married. She had 2 brothers in Phoenix who sent cards at Christmas and had nothing to do with the store. She had a part-time helper named Concepcion, who had worked Saturdays for 11 years, and who came more often during the last 2 years, without being asked, and without accepting additional pay. Because she could see what the ledger numbers were doing, and she was not the kind of woman who looked away from a thing like that. Agnes had extended credit to 43 families over the course of the store's history. She knew most of their children's names. Have you ever known someone who held a community together on credit, who let the dry years run long and trusted that the good years would settle the balance, and who was still there, still behind the counter, when the market changed and the community moved on to cheaper shelves without ever saying thank you? Some of you bought groceries on ledger credit from a store like this one. Some of you are the children of families whose names are in a ledger like Agnes Coulter's. The supermarket had opened on U.S. Highway 60, east of town, in the spring of 1958. It was called Mesa Foods, and it had a parking lot and fluorescent lighting and prices marked on every item in a uniform black stamp, and the ranching families of the area had been driving to it since May because the prices were lower and the selection was wider, and a man did not have to carry a balance that felt like an obligation. The ranchers who came to Agnes still came for the things Mesa Foods did not carry: the specialty items, the dry goods in small quantities, the items they needed between grocery runs. But the cash trade had moved to the highway, and cash trade was how a store stayed solvent. And what remained for Agnes was the ledger trade. And the ledger trade had been accumulating since 1921 and settling slower every year. By October 1959, the outstanding ledger balances across all accounts totaled $4,760. Some of it was old, from the dry years of 1952 and 1953, when the ranches had run hard and settled what they could. Some of it was recent, from families who had shifted their cash buying to Mesa Foods but still came to Agnes for certain things and still ran a tab. Agnes did not press them. Pressing was not how the relationship worked, and she knew it. But the store's own supplier invoices were $2,100 overdue, and the building's note required a $220 payment in November, and she had $180 in the account. She had done the arithmetic on Saturday night and put the notice in the window. The ranchers who saw the sign on Monday morning stopped in the way people stop when a thing they had assumed would always be there has announced that it will not. 3 of them came in that day and bought things, small purchases, things they did not particularly need, $1 or $2 apiece, because it was the only thing they could think to do that was actually doing something. It was not enough. They knew it was not enough. The woman who ran the post office had seen the sign from the street and had come to the window and stood there for a moment before going back inside. The owner of the hardware store had crossed the street and read the sign and gone home and not mentioned it to anyone, because there was nothing to say that would make the arithmetic come out different. Nobody moved. Nobody could. The ledger said what it said, and the market had moved, and there was no argument available against either fact. You know that particular helplessness, when the right thing was already over, before anyone had a chance to prevent it. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The man who came through the door on a Wednesday morning had driven through Wickenburg the night before and stayed at the Hassayampa Hotel on Wickenburg Way. He was passing through Arizona on personal business and had stopped for the night because the drive was long and the Hassayampa was a place he had stayed before and found adequate. He had walked Tegner Street after breakfast, the way he walked unfamiliar streets, looking at what was there, what the buildings said about the town's history and character. He had read the notice in Agnes Coulter's window without stopping, then walked to the end of the block, then walked back and came in. Agnes was behind the counter with the accounts ledger open, not doing figures so much as sitting with the book the way a person sits with a thing they have decided to let go of and have not quite finished letting go of. He came to the counter. He set his hat down. He said he needed salt and flour and a can of coffee and asked if she had dried pinnon beans. She did. She filled the order. She wrote the items and the total on the counter pad the way she wrote every transaction and told him the amount. He paid. He looked at the ledger on the counter. He said, "Is that the store accounts?" She said it was. He said, "How much is outstanding?" She looked at him. She said, "That's not your concern." He said, "I'm going to make it my concern." He looked at the notice in the window, which was visible from where he stood, and then back at her. "I travel through this country regularly. I need provisions on every pass-through. I'd rather have a store I trust than drive to a supermarket on the highway." He set both hands on the counter. "Tell me the number," she told him. $4,760. Agnes Coulter has not moved. Her hands are flat on the ledger. She is looking at the man across the counter, and the morning light is coming through the south window and laying itself across the dark oak in long gold bars, and she does not know yet what she is looking at. He said, "I want to settle the outstanding accounts. All of them." He reached into his coat. "Consider it prepayment for every supply run I make through this town for the next 10 years. I come through this country 6 times a year. At $200 a run, that's $12,000 in future trade. You're giving me a substantial discount." She said, "You're not buying $12,000 of provisions." He said, "No." He set the cash on the counter. But the arithmetic is not wrong. He took the ledger. He did not read the names. He did not turn through the pages. He simply held it the way a man holds something he is returning rather than taking, and set it back on the counter in front of her. He said, "Mark them settled. The families don't need to know where the settlement came from." Agnes kept the ledger closed for a moment after he left. Then she opened it to the first page. She drew a single line through the balance. Then the next page. Then the next. She worked through the accounts in order from the first page to the last, the way she had entered them all, drawing the settlement line in the same clean hand she had used for 38 years of bookkeeping. When she reached the last page, she closed the book. She sat at the counter for a while without moving. The store did not close in November. Agnes wrote to her suppliers that same week and paid the $2,100 outstanding in full and arranged a clean schedule of terms going forward. She made the November note payment with enough to carry through the spring. She rebuilt the cash reserve by January, slowly, the way she had always managed the store, by buying right and selling fair and not spending what was not yet earned. Mesa Foods on the highway kept the cash grocery trade. Agnes kept the families who needed credit, and the ranchers who valued a relationship, and the men passing through the desert country who needed provisions from someone they could trust. The store kept its character because Agnes kept her principles. She ran the store for 14 more years without putting a closing notice in the window again. She turned the accounts over to Concepcion in 1965, which was not an official handover so much as an acknowledgement of what had been true for several years, that Concepcion understood the ledger the way Agnes did, and managed the customer relationships with the same patience. Agnes stayed at the counter until 1973, when her knees said enough and she had a conversation with Concepcion that lasted 2 hours and ended with a handshake across the oak counter that both of them understood to mean more than a business arrangement. Concepcion ran the store until 1988. The ledger system survived until 1981, when enough of the valley's ranching operations had computerized their own accounts that ledger credit felt anachronistic to the younger generation. But it ran for 22 years after the morning Agnes drew those settlement lines, which was 22 more years than the arithmetic of October 1959 had allowed for. Think about what settling $4.760 in outstanding accounts on a Wednesday morning in October 1959 became. Agnes ran the store from that morning through 1973, 14 more years. Concepcion ran it 15 years after that. Between them, the store on Tegner Street served the families of the Wickenburg Valley for 29 more years from the morning the accounts went to zero. That is 29 more years of ledger credit extended to ranch families in dry seasons. 29 more years of flour and salt and dried chiles and pinon coffee available to anyone who walked through the door. Concepcion's children grew up knowing the store the way Agnes had grown up knowing it, by working it, by learning the names, by understanding that a ledger balance is not a debt so much as a relationship kept in numbers. The outstanding balance in October 1959 was $4,760 in change. The building's note was overdue. The supplier invoices were overdue. One man's arithmetic, 6 passes a year, 200 a pass, 10 years, cleared the whole of it in one morning, and Agnes Coulter knew what to do with a clean ledger. On the wall behind the counter at the Tegner Street building, it is a real estate office now, has been since 1991. But the dark oak counter is still there because the new owners kept it as a reception desk. There is a framed page. The frame is simple wood, no glass, and the page inside it is a leaf from the store's accounts ledger, not any particular customer's account. But the inside front cover of the 1959 ledger, which Agnes had written in her careful hand when she opened the book, that January store accounts, year 1959. Agnes V. Coulter, proprietor, Wickenburg, Arizona. Concepcion hung it when she closed in 1988, on the wall where Agnes had always kept the calendar, because she could not bring herself to put it in a box. The afternoon light from the south window comes across the page the same as it always came across the counter, in the same long gold bar, at the same hour. The oak counter is still smooth at the lip. The floorboards are still worn through to raw wood on the main path from the door. If you find yourself in Wickenburg and walk down Tegner Street, the building is 4 blocks from the Hassayampa River crossing, the stone-faced one with the wide front window. The real estate office keeps regular hours. The counter is the same counter. The framed ledger cover is on the north wall behind it. You will know it because it is written in a hand that means business. Some of you have known someone who extended credit to an entire community year after year in good faith, and who asked nothing back but the next season's settlement. This story is for them. John Wayne never told anyone, not Agnes Coulter's name, not the store on Tegner Street, not the ledger or the accounts or the amount. He drove out of Wickenburg that morning on the highway south and said nothing to anyone in the car with him, nothing in any interview that year or any year after, nothing in any letter that has been found. What is known is what Concepcion's daughter wrote in the obituary she drafted for Agnes in 1991, in the section describing the store's history. A single sentence about an October morning in 1959 when a stranger came in and bought salt and flour and coffee and asked about a ledger and settled the outstanding accounts and walked out, and the store did not close, which was all Agnes had ever told Concepcion about it, and which Concepcion had told her daughter once, and which was enough. A man walked into a general store in Arizona on a Wednesday morning and bought salt and flour and coffee and dried pinon beans and asked about a ledger. He set the arithmetic on the counter and made it work and walked out. He did not look back. He did not turn. He lifted one hand at the door, easy and loose, the way a man raises a hand to answer a question he already knows the answer to. And then the screen door closed, and he was gone. That is most of how it ever got out at all. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There is another one like it every week. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.